Second investigation on this matter have discovered that WikiLeaks published an article that bin Laden's death or body was not buried at sea, and that the body was taken back to Dover Air Force Base on a plane that was guarded by the CIA and was examined, and there it was to be cremated. Now, Drudge reported that this week, and then they quickly withdrew the story, along with other major news agencies that was going with the WikiLeaks story, but for whatever reason, they withdrew it in midstream. I've gone ahead now and through my investigative sources been able to determine that the reason why Andrew Breitbart was killed was because he had discovered incontrovertible evidence that the Chinook helicopter that went down in Afghanistan in August was taken down by a suicide bomber, one of the 8 Afghans that was on that Chinook helicopter, and 22 of the members of the Navy SEAL Team 6, this very same team that was alleged to have captured and killed Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad, Pakistan, going back to April or May of 2011. This Navy SEAL team was killed. They were killed that they might remain silent about there was no raid, there was no Osama bin Laden body, and that it was all a hoax. Now, anybody who's been around the military for any length of time would know 22 Navy SEAL teams, 30 Americans all total, and 8 Afghanistan Taliban soldiers on a Chinook helicopter, and then they all go down in one fell swoop. Very, very suspicious. But what's more suspicious, that Chinook helicopter went down on the 7th of August of the year 2011. General David Petraeus, who was in charge of the Afghan war and was the highest ranking military general over the armed forces, was promoted from the high ranking general and given the position of director of the CIA, which was very strange. Leon Panetta, who was then the CIA director, was given a position of Secretary of Defense. There was no Osama bin Laden killing. There was no Osama bin Laden capture. It was all a hoax, mainly to do 2 things. One, to camouflage and to quieting the questions about Barack Hussein Obama's eligibility and the birth certificate that he presented, that it was a forgery, and to change the views, change the direction, change the conversation in America. What more would change the conversation? What were the 2 biggest issues going on underground and above ground in America? Underground was the fact that Obama is not a U.S. citizen, that he is wholly ineligible. He is not constitutionally eligible, rather. Let me put it that way. Obama is not constitutionally eligible. That was conversation number 1. Conversation number 2 that had faded was still major, was that Barack Hussein Obama now has killed and captured the most wanted man on the planet in Osama bin Laden. 2 of the major conversations, and one canceled out the other. It was a very shrewd move by the Obama administration. There were 2 fakes presented to us in April. One was the fake birth certificate. The other was the fake death certificate of Osama bin Laden. 2 major fakes that the world will not soon forget, and I will continue to uncover. But let me ask you a question, because a lot of people like to disagree with me. And most, as I said before, 90% of all Americans are very liberal. They are willing, because everybody knows that Obama is not constitutionally eligible to serve for a litany of reasons, but more recently because of his criminal activity in the forged birth certificate, the forged certificate of live birth. But I raised the question the other day about the psyche of America and why America is so liberal, and people that think they're conservative are as liberal as the left, less intelligent bastards. I raised the question that during the Cold War, when Brezhnev, Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union, prior to Ronald Reagan telling Gorbachev to tear down the wall in Berlin, when we had bomb shelters in every school, every church, and every major building in America because we were in a Cold War, we thought that perhaps we might get nuked by the Soviet Union, and the bomb shelters were there to protect us. Would we, during that time, or during the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, do you think that 10 years after Khrushchev and the Cuban Missile Crisis, that we would have voted for a person named Viktor Gorbachev or Viktor Yushchenko or Viktor Khrushchev, even though the person was not raised in Russia, and the mother of Viktor Yushchenko or Viktor Khrushchev or Viktor Gorbachev was white, but the father was a visiting student and had come in from Minsk, Russia, to study at Harvard, and fell in love or had sex with a white woman, and a child was born, and the child was named Viktor Yushchenko, and then later on would want to run for president. Do you think that America would have voted for a president named Viktor Yushchenko during the Cold War? Absolutely not. So now why would they vote for 9 years after, or 7 years after the 9/11 incident and the World Trade Center bombings, why would they vote for a Muslim after the name Osama bin Laden was the most famous name on the planet? Why do they do that? The reason being is because most Americans and most conservative Americans and Republicans are as liberal as you can possibly be, number one. But let's go back to the fact that the CIA is now headed by David Petraeus. He was promoted out of the field. Obama brought him out of the field because he knew that there was no raid at Abbottabad, that crashed helicopter was simply a staged helicopter crash. There was no capture, there was no killing of Osama bin Laden, there was no transfer to the U.S. Carl Vinson, and there was no burial at sea. Now, WikiLeaks leaked the story, and Drudge and other major news agencies carried it, including the Associated Press, but in the middle of the day, they retracted the story saying there was not enough evidence. WikiLeaks had the evidence, and the evidence is still there. Breitbart was killed because he had the evidence before WikiLeaks. Not before WikiLeaks, but from WikiLeaks, before WikiLeaks leaked the information to the press. Indeed, WikiLeaks had this information prior to. They had leaked it to Breitbart. Breitbart was sitting on it. The CIA knew that Breitbart had it. They whacked him. WikiLeaks then released the information. They released it. Now, here's the scenario. Sean Hannity said that he was going to release the tapes that Breitbart spoke about at CPAC, which was nothing, just Obama's rowdy anarchist days at Harvard, but there was nothing to it. The release of that information by Sean Hannity was a fraud and an insult to the integrity of investigative journalism. Here's the scenario. Breitbart had received from WikiLeaks the information that there was no raid at Abbottabad, that Osama bin Laden was not killed, that General David Petraeus had been removed from his field command and kicked up to the level of CIA to keep him quiet about the fact that there was no raid, that the army that was not involved in moving from Afghanistan to Abbottabad, Pakistan. He was given a high-ranking position to keep him quiet. Leon Panetta, who was a CIA agent who knew there was also nothing, was kicked up to the Secretary of Defense. Breitbart knew this, and you can document it yourself. Just go back and check the records of the date that Chinook helicopter went down with 22 Navy SEALs on board. I mean, why would you put all that, your eggs in one basket? And that Chinook helicopter, the weaponry plan, the defense plan, the deployment plan of the Chinook is that they should fly in tandem, two of them. And that there's radar, there's air cover, there's all kinds. You don't shoot down a Chinook helicopter. You might shoot a Huey, but you don't shoot down a Chinook, and everybody knows that. My friend Captain Neil Turner suggested and intimated that very possibly on board that ship, Chinook, was